that we're going to be recording this webinar. So we've got quite a few people booked into this webinar. It looks like some of them haven't been able to start or join us right at the start, but we will be recording this webinar just to make you aware so that people can access this at any time. And by attending today, you'll also be sent a link to the webinar as well. So to say welcome to the webinar. It's part of the CPD module from Learning Futures. We've done a quick audio check. You will see that there is a drop down arrow next to your speaker, the green speaker at the top of the screen. If you need to adjust the volume, you can try that as well if you need to. If for any reason you get dropped out of the meeting, then it takes about a minute or so for you to come back in. So just do that as and when you need to. If you find that the speaker gets dropped out for any reason, other than it being very embarrassing, what we'll do is make sure that they come and join back in as well, but it may take them a minute or so. And one of us will pick up the gap until that speaker comes back in again. So if you find that you're not hearing anybody, then just use the chat area in the bottom right hand corner to make people aware. Before we start the webinar as well, just to make you familiar with what you can see on the screen, at the top of the screen as well as your speaker, there should be a small icon of a person holding their hand up, and next to it says set status. And if you click on the drop down arrow next to there, you'll see that next to your name you'll be able to, if you wanted to put laughter, then you'll see the icon that goes there, or applause. If you want to use those throughout any of today's webinar, by all means do, but just remember to clear the status at the end as well, so otherwise that icon's going to stay there. So by all means use those as we go through today. Maria, thank you. Round of applause. Moving on to our agenda, so we've got, as I say, very delighted to be joined by Ron Mitchell from Mitchell Media today, who's going to be our key speaker. Ron's recognised as a leading authority on Xerte within the sector, and I know that he's put together a really interesting content to introduce in this webinar. So I'm going to introduce Ron in a second, but before I do, just to make you aware that this is a three-stage process really that we recommend. The webinar is really the first step, and what we encourage people to do is, once we've had the webinar, towards the end of the webinar, I'm going to just show you some online resources that we've put together and some activities that you're able to pick and choose from to help you apply some of this back into your place of work. All of this is available free of charge. What we do ask is that if you use any of the resources, if you found the webinar useful, then to share that and join the communities of practice on the Learning Futures website. So you can put a blog, you can share some useful resources, but to let other people know how you're getting on. So if you use some of this information that you get from today and the online resources, then great, but we'd ask if you can share how that goes for you. You may already be aware that it's part of a series of CPD modules that we have available for you. Some of those have been recorded already and you can get the recordings accessible online. Others we've got still lined up, so you can still attend the live webinars if you want to. But without any further ado, what I'd like to do is to introduce you to Ron Mitchell and ask Ron just to give a quick introduction to himself and then to start his presentation.
Thanks, Rob. Can I share my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay. So, hopefully this is going to work for everybody. Okay. Thank you, Rob. I'll introduce myself a little bit further in a moment, but I just wanted to pick up a couple of key points. The way I've planned this is a quick introduction, and then some kind of general topics that they'll overlap a bit, and I'm sure I'll repeat myself a bit as well with some key points. But the kind of general breakdown is what is Xerte in the story so far, examples of how Xerte is used in the sector, why you should use Xerte and how to get the most out of it. And then maybe what's new and the road ahead, depending on an interaction we're going to do shortly. Question and answer at the end, but also in between these topics. I don't want to talk continuously for 30 minutes or so. So I'm happy to kind of break it up into these kind of discrete topics, and we'll take some questions and interact between them if we can. And then I think Rob is going to mostly talk about your next steps, but I might chip in with a few recommendations as well. Key point really is that this is about awareness raising rather than hands-on how to use Xerte. There'll be a little bit of that, hopefully, but I need to kind of gauge your experience of using Xerte anyway, which we'll do in a minute. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that it's traditional in these kinds of things to use a PowerPoint to present with, because that's what the webinar tools typically like doing and make it easy to do. And there is an extra kind of bandwidth issue with sharing screens. Hopefully we won't have any problems. And the reason I don't tend to, I think PowerPoint's great when used effectively, and I use it all the time, and I use it to create graphics and things for use in Xerte. But when I'm kind of talking and presenting about Xerte, I like to practice what I'm preach. So what you're looking at now is a Xerte learning object. It might look slightly different to what you're used to, because I've kind of reskinned the learning object to match the kind of Learning Futures branding, as hopefully that's clear. I move on to the next slide. I don't really want to bore you about my history and background. Some of you may know me from various national and regional projects that's been about for a long time. I've probably forgotten some key ones, to be honest, there, but things like MoleNet and the ECPD program, and if I go further back, the Q projects were great examples of CPD, and a lot of it not too different to, I guess, the program that you're involved in today, if you're part of the official projects, or even if you're part of the wider community. There's a mention of Feltag there, a jokey thing on the t-shirt. We'll maybe touch on that throughout, because I think there's an awful lot of hype and misunderstanding and misinterpretation. And I think the key things I want to pick out about Feltag is just really the quality aspect, the quality of online learning materials. If it's going to be wholly online learning, there's obviously a key quality requirement. And the scary bit for me, there's a lot of hype about the 10%. The hype isn't, or the scary bit isn't the 10%. The scary bit for me, or not scary, but the reality check that we all need to kind of be aware of, is the reference to all courses and all classes and all staff. Because for me, what we have across the sector still, and probably will have for a long time, is a very spiky profile, not only in terms of skills, but in terms of use and awareness. And we could talk about Feltag all day, really, couldn't we? And that's not the subject of this, but we'll touch on that a little bit as we go through it, I think. The other thing to mention is a lot of these Xerte pages that I've got, I've kind of developed a method of kind of presenting in webinars like this, so that you're seeing almost the equivalent of a PowerPoint slide, and then it's using the accordion navigator, so there's a notes and links panel that you can click. And sorry, I don't want to flood you with pictures of me, but there's a kind of an extra bit that you can read if you're really so interested. Read about my background and various things, and some links to some other resources there as well. Okay, so this is where I want to stop sharing for a moment and get you to give me some idea about your experience with Xerte. So I'm going to share a document. Go, and you should all be able to draw on that screen now. And if you can put a tick to the description that most closely represents your experience of Xerte, that will be very useful. Or maybe use the text tool to, and maybe Rob, if I'm not aware of enabling that, okay, so people are putting in the text chat rather than ticking the document. What I was hoping for was just a kind of tick like this on there. Not used or seen it before. Okay, so you'll need to use text chat. Okay, Emily, you've said you've used Xerte in a minute. I'm going to quote you shortly. In fact, okay, so it looks like we haven't got too many people that have used it regularly, which is fine. I'm kind of prepared for that, but I wanted to be conscious that if there were some regular users amongst us, that we can provide some examples and resources that would be useful to them too. So I'm going to stop sharing that and switch back to sharing my screen. Okay. So in the text chat earlier on, for those that were in early, I posted a link to a video. I'm not going to play this now. It's arguably a bit too long, but it's something I created to summarize the Xerte journey so far. So you'll have links to this learning object and any others that I show you shortly. So you'll be able to refer to this. And again, there's a kind of notes panel that includes both a transcript and a link to another resource that complements that video. Emily, I haven't quoted you. I've made these anonymous, but if anyone attended the last Learning Futures webinar, I kind of watched the recording of that, and there was a bit of a discussion that cropped up about Xerte. And as you can see from the quotes that you're reading on screen, I wondered about calling these, instead of participant one, grumpy participant and happy participant. Obviously, I'm joking. People are entitled to their own opinions about different tools, but I think to a certain extent they missed the point, and that's one of my objectives today. And I've kind of jokingly referred to the Tripadvisor Factor here because I don't know your experience, but if you go online on something like Tripadvisor, you'd never go and stay anywhere because the positive comments and the negative comments, but it's also too easy to kind of focus on the negative comments and get swayed by that without experiencing the reality for yourself. And obviously, when there's a cost of a holiday involved, there's an expense in that. What I would say is, in terms of trying Xerte and judging for yourself, actually it's a free and open source tool, and there really isn't that kind of barrier to trying for yourself and making your own informed decisions. And just to evidence that, here's a selection of quotes from existing Xerte users, and I'm not expecting you to read all this on screen now, but you'll see, and this is just a selection, a range of different types of organization and the kinds of things that they're saying. And these are kind of experienced users of Xerte, and obviously they all started at some point and have gauged these opinions and evidence and success through kind of really using the tools. And that's what I would recommend that obviously everybody does, rather than kind of listen to that Tripadvisor Factor. There's another thing here. Often people don't compare like for like. So again, you'll have a link to this list, and this is kind of a bit of a lead-in list because all of the ticks here apply to Xerte. It's easy to use. I would argue it's easy to use for everyone and anyone. And I'm not going to read through these ticks. I put one little cross just to share a negative at the moment, and particularly for those of you that use Articulate products. You might laugh and say, ha ha ha, Articulate provides tin can experience API support and Xerte doesn't. Well, actually, that's not completely true, and there's a good chance that you don't necessarily know what that means either. We do have the possibility of including Tin Can Experience API, and it's kind of a newer version of SCORM for those that do know the reference to SCORM. The challenge is how you then track and surface that data that's tracked. So it's coming, it's on the way, it's something we're developing, and it's not really a negative, because actually it's more about how we do it rather than can we do it. And there may be other considerations that I'm not thought of here in terms of comparing and selecting tools. But I would ask you and prompt you to consider these things when you're comparing any tools that you currently use with what you might be able to do with Xerte. Usually during face-to-face training sessions, I've done a lot over the years, from the very early versions of Xerte to more recent fully fledged HTML5 output and all that kind of thing. I remember an RSC London event, and Epping Forest were in attendance. And again, you'll be able to explore this in your own time, but there's a great little, or a couple of videos, and a case study from Epping Forest. And again, I'm not going to play this video, close that. But what they did was listen to my point that I always say, that even if you're not convinced about using Xerte yourself, perhaps you've got the skills to use a more complex tool, at least consider allowing your students and enabling your students to use it, and potentially watch what they do. And there's some fantastic examples, not just from Epping Forest, but from across the sector, of how organisations and individual tutors have done exactly that. So here's some further case studies, some of which I know are linked on the Learning Futures site already in the scoop it that's been prepared. There's a few extra ones here. The shame about some of the GIST case studies that some of the RSCs put together is that with the changes in GIST, the kind of original pages where a richer collection of resources seem to have disappeared in some cases. So the first few here that apply to kind of adult education and FE are typically PDF documents rather than kind of fully fledged web pages. But the rest of them are all still live case studies, and as I say, you'll be able to explore them. A common feature of all of these is just how frequent it's become the norm for organisations and individual tutors to exploit this ability for students to use the tool. And some great examples of learning objects that students have created either individually or as part of collaborative peer work, and so on. If any of you are experienced users, or if you view any of the examples that we've got here, and I'm going to point you to the link to this resource in a moment, I've embedded a Google form, and this is a great way of kind of collecting feedback on Xerte learning objects by embedding not just Google Forms, but any kind of system that you can collect feedback from or collect student interaction from. And so this is just a simple example of a Google form embedded in a Xerte page, where you can paste the link of a learning object that you've looked at, and then some comments and feedback. And when you submit the form, you'll see a link to the results of that, and be able to kind of learn from other people's comments, and obviously share examples that perhaps aren't in the examples that I've already shared on the other pages. So it's kind of a bit of a dynamic way of populating this learning resource with additional examples. Okay, so I'm going to put this link in the text chat, but if you do have a QR code reader on the machine that you're using, or on a tablet or mobile device, obviously you could scan that QR code, and the link is in the text chat, and that will open this learning resource that I've been using to present with. So I suggest, just for 2 or 3 minutes, explore some of these examples. So there were the case studies on the previous page, and the examples I'm going to just quickly talk through here. We have a Xerte demonstrator, what we call a technical demonstrator. And it's not necessarily a piece of learning content as such, but it's a demonstration of the majority of the page types we have in the main template. And what you might want to do if you view this example is skip through to the interactive pages. And the way you would do this from the link you've got is just to click on the screenshot or thumbnail, and it will open that resource in a new window. We also have another template called the site or Bootstrap template. And often during face-to-face training, I hear people at the back of the room suddenly proclaiming, "I've just built an app." And in my experience, there's a lot of wasted money, quite frankly, by organisations that have gone down the road of building a bespoke app, when actually most of what that app is for is providing content. And if you want to do that, then Xerte is a fantastic tool, not just the Bootstrap template, for the main template as well, for providing the kind of mobile compatible, mobile friendly content that you would do in a content type app, rather than an app that taps into the functionality of the device. And what I would say is, if you look at some of the kind of educational apps that you see that are typically just content apps, and then consider whether you could have achieved the same thing quickly, more easily, and certainly more cheaply using Xerte. There's Sam the dog example, and I often use this during face-to-face training because it's a fantastic example of, it's not a learning resource that contains lots of bells and whistles, but it does demonstrate a learning sequence, a learning design, and it'll be interesting in the future webinar on learning design how much of this is kind of covered, because it contains very simple interactions. It contains a sequence of information giving, and it's all written in a kind of storytelling, problem-solving way. And what you'll see if you view this is that throughout there's some simple kind of reflective prompts. You can see, if you navigate through it, the build-up of complexity, and you know, the kind of difficulty level in terms of understanding or interacting with the content. And often people focus on the kind of the look and feel and the bells and whistles. This is a proven, tried and tested resource, and has been improved over time based on student feedback. And again, that's one of the things that Xerte enables you to do very quickly, because it's so quick and easy to make changes. And because you're offering online, I could make a change to this learning object now when we kind of stop presenting for a moment, and it would be instantly available. When you think about some other learning authoring tools, that really isn't. It's a real barrier to improve and change resources, because just of the time involved in kind of re-editing, republishing, re-uploading, remaking available. And with Xerte, because you're authoring online, and I should qualify that with Xerte Online Toolkits, because there is the older developer tool. With Xerte Online Toolkits, you're authoring online, and those changes can be made available to your students instantly. There's a Xerte SCORM example, and this is an example where the linear navigation is turned off. And those that are familiar with a tool like Articulate Storyline would also be familiar with the kind of general look and feel of using a human kind of avatar or pictures of people throughout. So it's a kind of scenario-based storytelling, or not storytelling as such, but scenario-based non-linear branching example, and that's perfectly possible within Xerte. Like with any tool, you need to carefully plan that kind of interaction, because you can end up taking the learner down the dead end, if you like, and not being able to get back. But it's about the learner being able to make choices and see the consequences of those choices. And eventually they can end up at the same destination, but it's them pulling the content based on their understanding or need or choices that they make, rather than the typical linear navigation. And I often hear people saying, or being quite negative about Xerte, that it's click-through interaction because of the kind of forward and next button. Well, actually, that has some real benefits in terms of familiarity, particularly when it comes to accessibility, but it doesn't have to be that way, and you have the options of building non-linear, far more scenario-based interactions. And in fact, talking about Xerte and Articulate together. There's some examples on the Maths Online site where we've done exactly that. And in the example that I've linked here from the screenshot, I challenge you to kind of just look at that and decide for yourself which pages are native Xerte and which pages are embedded Articulate content, because actually they're both used interactively and they're both used for different reasons and for the strengths of each. So it's not either or, and if you're a fan of any particular tool, the good news about Xerte is that it will happily enable you to embed that content into a Xerte piece. And so one of the ways you can do that is you have your specialist developers, your e-learning technologists, develop that more specialized content, and you can edit and build and populate the pages either side of that to, for instance, test understanding or provide additional content. And even as simple as making text changes can be a massive benefit to work collaboratively on a tool with a specialist, rather than every single change that you require having to go back to the specialist to make those changes. I'm going to stop talking for a moment and get you to feed back on the resources and explore this resource a little bit before we move on. But a couple more examples. There's a combination of two different projects and templates from Alistair McNaught that in reality provide an example of what you would do. You wouldn't necessarily contain everything in one particular resource or one particular tool, and this uses a range of tools including things like Google Forms and different images and video and audio, combining them into an overall resource for that particular topic that's being covered. So I'd encourage you to view that. There's a using rich media resource that again Alistair and I are working on delivering some courses. In fact, my next webinar is tomorrow, covering the next one in this sequence. And what we're doing is a bit like we're doing now, is preparing Xerte learning objects to deliver the webinar session, but then that also becomes a self-access resource in much more detail, much more interaction than we could cover during the webinar, the short period of the webinar. And in a way, going back to Feldtag, I think that's where the power lies, if you like, that using the tool like Xerte to create truly interactive self-access resources, not just PowerPoints that actually don't mean anything outside of the face-to-face presentation, but truly self-contained interactive resources. And the fact that Xerte can be used by anyone is a real facilitator and enabler in that respect. There are many more examples. Again, you'll find in this link here, some of them brand new. And so you'll find a link to my Scoop It and the Learning Futures Scoop It, and also Delicious and Digo feeds, and so on. So I'm going to pause talking for the moment. I'll ask you, Rob, if there was any questions that I've missed or need to pick up on. And perhaps just a couple of minutes, a breather for people to have a look at the resource, and then we'll move on to the next one that I want to cover and demonstrate. And obviously do put, can't open the link. See. Not sure why that would be the case. I'll put the full link in here just in case, rather than the shortened one. Okay, so there seems to be a really like the new Xerte showcase, John. Yes, that's actually a resource that I'm going to cover next, and particularly the whole background to building that. Oh no, sorry, that's not the one. That's the technical demonstrator that you're referring to there, John. And I mean, to be honest, I've been using Xerte since day one. I was part of the development of it that you'll hear and read about in the video that I shared. I still use that technical demonstrator to remind myself when I'm thinking about developing some new content, what page type should I use, what interactions should I use, and you know, the reality is that you kind of just have to do that because I mean, these days we don't necessarily use things like storyboarding. You can go straight into what's classed as a rapid authoring tool and start developing. But that can be a bit like kind of writer's block, if you like, that you're staring at a blank screen and struggling for inspiration, and using the technical demonstrators as a reminder of the kinds of things that you can achieve is a great way to kind of get past that point and to think more creatively about, okay, so and that needs to be your thought process. There needs to be from a teaching and learning perspective, not a technical perspective. One of the things that has come out from the student projects is they see kind of 56 different page types and they try to use them all in their learning object, and obviously that's not the point. That's you know, that's just not what you would do. And in fact, in the new version of Xerte, there will be fewer page types, because the reason we had so many is the old Flash player, you had to have dedicated page types to achieve things with Flash that now with HTML5 you don't need to. So for instance, whereas the plain text page in the old Flash version was probably the least popular page, text behind glass isn't really using or adding any value to what you would create. It now almost becomes the most popular page because we have a WYSIWYG editor which enables you to put any number of images and graphics and different size text and things on the single page. So a bit like a Moodle page where you can use the WYSIWYG editor to add your content and to add multiple pictures. You'll be able to do that in the new version of Xerte, and there's a demonstration in the next learning resource we're going to look at. Not sure who Learning Futures is. I guess that's you, Rob, under Learning Futures post. Yeah, okay. So resizing of graphics in the Bootstrap, absolutely. The idea of the Bootstrap template, and it's a funny name for people that don't know that, it's based on a thing called the Twitter Bootstrap library. But basically it's responsive web design, and it's responsive web design without you having to know anything about responsive web design. And in practicality, what it means is all for once, use anywhere. If you create a resource using the Bootstrap template, it will look equally as good on a desktop or laptop as it will on a small handheld device. And obviously there's a grey area there now because phones are getting bigger, tablets are getting smaller. There's no one size fits all. The good thing about the technical side of Xerte is that compatibility is probably better than most tools you will find. It's very, I wouldn't say pure HTML, but it is HTML, including the text. The text is all selectable and reflowable, and you'll find that it works technically on the vast majority of devices. And the reason I keep referring to technically is pedagogically, some of the interactions you just wouldn't expect learners to do on a tiny little handheld. Now, as I say, it's a grey area because I'm sure you, like I, have seen lots of people with phones that are 3 times the size of the kind of phone that I would you know, be happy using, and they are more like tablets, and therefore on a tablet size phone or a tablet size device, just about all of the interactions are going to work. But the smaller you go, both practically and pedagogically, you need to be careful with your learning design and what you're expecting the students to do, and it does become more of a teaching and learning consideration than it does a technical consideration. You know, what do you do yourself on a phone compared with a tablet or a laptop or a desktop? And it's really just a case of signposting those things. Okay, so I'm going to carry on presenting now. There doesn't seem to be too many questions in the text chat, but some useful comments about the resources. And yes, actually, Sam the dog is a great example, a great simple example of a learning sequence that's been tried and tested, and very, very positively thought of by the students involved and the teacher involved. And there's a number of examples linked in there as well. Maria, how is it? How do we get started? Is it a download? I'll come on to that shortly. So remind me about that if I don't cover that, but I certainly will. I'm going to move on in my presentation now. Hopefully you're all still seeing my screen. Some key points very quickly, and I'm going to just display these before we move on. Xerte is a tool aimed at everybody, not just specialists. So when you compare examples that you see, either the ones that I've shared here directly or in the Scoop It and Delicious Feeds and that kind of thing, bear in mind that they're often resources that have been developed by teachers and learners and not necessarily specialist developers. So you can't compare those resources with the endless resources and skills that might have been created in a commercial resource. Actually, in terms of accessibility, Xerte is second to none, and if you compare the accessibility, because it's built into the tool, it will compare very favorably. That's not to say there aren't some fantastic examples, there are, but just bear in mind that this is the whole point, and the key benefit is that Xerte becomes a tool for every single learner, every single member of staff. And we use the analogy that if you bought something online in the last year, if you can fill in an online form, then you can use Xerte. Certainly technically that's the case. Pedagogically, obviously, there's a lot more to it, and the learning design session coming up may touch on some of that in more time than I've got here. You'll be able to read these key points in your own time as well, so I'll move on from that. Just before I move on to the other resource, I've put some links to the various support areas. There's 3 different mailing lists, and the one that you would want if you're a practitioner rather than involved in the technical side is the Xerte for Teachers mailing list. And there's obviously the community site as well if you haven't discovered that. So both of those places are very much teaching and learning focused, and where you can get free support on kind of any aspect of Xerte. Before I link to the next resource, this is a reminder really that in the Xerte main template, there's a QR code page. And the way I always recommend people use this is to put a link to that particular learning object itself. So you make the learning object public, you copy the link, and you paste that in the page that then automatically generates the short URL and the QR code that you're seeing now. And the reason I always recommend that is, firstly, if you're using it during a face-to-face session, you've got the opportunity then to say, look, before you go, make a note, a handwritten note of this short URL, or take a picture of the QR code, and those learners, those colleagues, if you like, can instantly continuing reviewing that resource when they leave the room. And this very much is kind of, adding the extra value and adding the extra functionality that Xerte provides out of the box, that something like a PowerPoint that you might use. How many events do you go to where you hear the comment that the PowerPoint will be online in the next few days? Well, during this webinar right now, you'll be able to link to any of the resources that I've seen immediately after the resource, because they're online, they're created in Xerte, And also I can add to them and improve them, and you will instantly see those changes, or next time you visit you'll see those changes. No uploading, no separate uploading process, very quick and easy. And the other example of that is that if I embedded this Xerte learning object in 5, 6, 10 different Moodle courses, change it once and it's instantly updated in all of those. Everyone complains about lack of time developing resources, particularly in relevance to in relation to FELTAG and all of that. Again, this is a huge benefit if you get into the habit of having an institutional installation and linking your resources back to that installation, so you can change them, improve them, respond to learner feedback, learner confusion, and all of that kind of thing. And you know, it's also a key point that people often fall into the trap of getting hands on Xerte and trying to create one big learning object. What I would say is, with the ability to add a QR code page like this, or simply just to hyperlink from one learning object to another, it's in your interest and my experience to keep them small, keep them granular, and just link between them. Your learner won't know any different. They're just following the learning sequence that you've designed and provided. But for you, it will provide no end of benefits in terms of being able to reuse and create different sequences, and also some opportunities for differentiation by providing, you know, for instance, email links direct to a particular topic if you've identified that a learner is struggling with that particular topic. If that's all in one big learning object, that can be confusing and difficult to do. If you keep your learning objects into kind of subtopics, for want of a better term, it makes it far easier. So this is the other resource that I wanted to share, and this complements the video that I created about the story so far, and it's something that we're using to work on collaboratively now as well. So there's a page here that talks about the history of Xerte. If you haven't seen that video with Alistair McNaught at the beginning there, I'd encourage you to use that, because that it's a bit old now but still valid. And there's some information about the Apereo. What's quite easy to miss with the Bootstrap template is that there's a whole load of pages in this resource, and they will appear either as a set of links that you can read up the top, as we're seeing here, history, how and why, examples, and so on, or as a little collapsed panel if you're viewing on a mobile device. So you'll see a little kind of square panel that when you click it will expand and show you the menu options. So don't miss that. And the bit that I really want to cover is the how and why here. And this addresses the question about from Maria, I think it was, how do you get access to Xerte? Xerte is, or Xerte Online Toolkits is an online application, but it does need installation on a web server, and your objective should be to get an institutional installation. So on this page, the Getting Started page here at the top, there's some reference to a guide to installation and a page on the TechDisk Sandpit as to, now that the TechDisk Sandpit has closed, where to next, what can you do? And the options range from using it locally via a tool called XAMPP, where you can install it as a local web server, to having an installation across your organization, or to external hosting if you want that. And you can read those resources and that information to explore that further. There's also a bit of a simulation that I created a while ago, and it's the branding is a bit old here, but it's still quite functional. And if you view this resource, what it will do is explain to you all the different things within the Xerte workspace. So it's, again, a good reminder, but also an overview of how it works and how the authoring happens. Quick show in the text chat who's seen how to author with Xerte. Have you I think there were a few people. I'll play this anyway, because it's only a quick resource. The way that you create a resource with Xerte is you log in, you click on the create button, and this is using the main template. And then you're prompted via an online form, just like you were shopping, to type in some text. So we're naming the learning object here about Xerte Online Toolkits. And then we have a range of different page types that we can add. And here we're adding the graphics and sound page. So we select that. And then again, we're presented with a form to populate that form with some text. And I'm going to copy and paste some text to make that quick. And then you can browse for an image. Now in the new version you'll be able to do this via a WYSIWYG editor, but in this version we had a form where you browse for the image and you click open and it uploads, click OK, and then you scroll down and click the play button and there's that page that you just created. It's as simple and quick as that. And although it might be a strange interface to begin with, there's a school of thought that says with Xerte you only need to be shown how to use it for about half an hour and then you know how to use it. That's certainly true. The technical practicalities of using Xerte are very simple. The flip side of that is that when it comes to creating effective learning content and exploiting the full range of functionality, I'm finding it these days to actually a bit tricky to cover everything in a day's worth of training, simply because there is so much power and so much functionality. And I'm not talking about technical functionality, I'm talking about teaching and learning benefits and pedagogical benefits. So it's certainly cheap and easy to use and free to use, and you can grow with the tool in terms of the quality and the resources that you would create. Let's scroll through this very quickly. So not to labour the point, but it's all for everybody. So if you look at tools that you currently use an alternative and factor in the cost of enabling use of those tools by all staff and all students, including specialists in your organisation, generally the cost becomes prohibitive. You're talking about the equivalent of a site licence. That's rarely affordable with commercial tools. And with a free and open source like Xerte, it's quite frankly obvious that, you know, why shouldn't you if it's free and open source and free of licensing costs and agreements. We often have experienced developers say, oh, I've looked at Xerte, but I prefer Articulate or I prefer XYZ. And the reality is that it's not either or, as I've already kind of covered, and you'll see some of the examples from Learning Maths Online, for instance. You can use those tools together, and the key point is, again, you simply wouldn't have all staff and all students using Articulate Storyline. I'm just going to refer back to the text chat. We've got a question from Paul. We have around 5 minutes left. Okay. Do the learning materials produce reports for the MCQ, etc.? So that's SCORM, Paul, I guess you're talking about. And yes, Xerte will export as SCORM, and it will track the scores of a quiz and a multiple choice, and it will track views of individual pages. So you can export a SCORM and import it into the VLE, and it will provide quite a rich set of tracking data. The downside of doing that SCORM, and if you view the SCORM resource that I've linked to, is that falls into that trap of them making it difficult to update or being a barrier to keeping it updated. So what I would normally recommend is you create two separate learning objects, one with the quiz that you export as SCORM and benefit from the SCORM tracking, and you keep your presentation material and your self-test material that you don't need to track in Xerte itself. Okay, so you've got a wide range of resources to unpick here. Far more time than I can cover during the webinar. Just one last point to pick on what I said. the real power of Xerte is this ability to all for once and use anywhere, and that applies to both templates really if you're careful. And I'll leave you to explore the resources I've shared in more time. Accessibility is a key feature as well. If you compare the accessibility of something like Xerte with some of the output from other tools, there really is no comparison. Rob, I'll stop sharing and hand back to you, and we'll pick up on the last minute questions.
Brilliant, thank you, Ron. Just to say that if you do have any questions still, please feel free to put them in the chat area. But I'd just like to thank Ron as well, that it's been very, very useful in what Ron's shown us, and we've asked the impossible to squeeze everything within a short period of time. So by giving the links and giving us a chance to have a look at those during the webinar, but also after the webinar, thank you, Ron, because that's really, really helpful. What I'd like to do now is just to take you through the next steps to close off the CPD module. So I'm going to do that by sharing my screen to start with, and that's just going to take me a couple of seconds. And I'm going to just jump you onto the Learning Futures page. So that should load in a second. Yeah, great. On the Learning Futures page and under the CPD section, just going to go on to the Xerte area. And you see that the module is broken into the 3 steps that we said at the start. So we've got the input from Ron and the examples that we've got some time that we can have a look at following the webinar. But we've also put together some online resources and a CPD activity as well. So just to briefly show resources, that some of the examples that you've seen already, you're going to see duplicated in this Scoop It bucket that you've got here. So you'll see that we've had somebody spend some time online and hunt and search through all the stuff that's available to help really fine-tune and get to the stuff that's really helpful. So you'll see as I scroll through here, there's another photo of Ron. You can run, but you can't hide from photos of Ron. But you'll see the idea of this is to really help recognise that if you spend a bit of focused time online to the areas that we'd be pointing you towards. And we've also, as I say, done a quick CPD activity for you as well. So I'm just going to bring you back into the page. CPD activity. And the purpose of the activity, as I say, is to just give you something that you can dip into. So it's not recommended that you work from the first activity and all the way through, but if I just scroll back to the start, this is all accessible from the Learning Futures site, but you'll see there's some activity here. So if you're looking to have an overview of what is Xerte, if you've got colleagues that are saying, tell me what this stuff is about, then you'll see the recommendation that it would take about 30 minutes to have a quick look at a couple of videos that are on there, and also some suggestions of the extension activity that you might look at as well. So activity B, again, have a look at that and say, yeah, that might be useful for me. So what can it do for your learners, and the examples of what the different page types are like. And then some examples, so an example in the land-based studies, but also an example for hair and beauty. And as Ron mentioned, some of the really positive aspects about Xerte and accessibility. So we've put a quick activity there as well to help you look at the sort of accessibility options that are available. So that CPD activity, dip into it as you feel that's going to be most useful for you and your organisation. And all we'd ask you to do is to share how that goes for you and your organisation back onto the Learning Futures site. So just to bring you back to our slide. Should just be loading on your screen now. And that was that, just to pop you back to that 3-stage process of use the webinar. We'll send you the recording following today. You'll get that today. Have a look at the links that Ron's provided with you, and once again, thank you to Ron for those. Have a look at the online resources we've put together on the Learning Futures site and the CPD activity, and dip into those where you feel it's going to be most useful, and then back onto the Learning Futures site and share through either a blog or the useful resources section of how it's worked for you. But we hope that you found that really useful. If there are any questions, please do use the chat area. But other than that, we'd like to thank you for your attendance, thank Ron for his really useful input, and we hope that you enjoy exploring Xerte, and if you found the module useful, to continue to come back and look at the other CPD modules as well. Ron, if you're still there, just want to pick up a question from Maria.
Yeah, Maria, it's always a challenge. Yes, well there is. You can download. You'd need some help with this probably. You can download a thing called XAMPP and then get somebody to install Xerte on your local machine. There used to be the Just TechDis Sandpit, but obviously with the changes and Just TechDis disappearing, that hasn't been re-established. I have to say though that there's some positives to that. It might not seem that that's the case right now. Actually, John, yes, it will happily run on Moodle, and if you view some of the resources that I've shared, including my screencast, there's some on exactly that. So the technical barrier to, often you'll hear IT teams saying, well, you know, we'd have to get a new server and we'd have to do this and we'd have to do that. Often those, to be fair to them, those barriers are more about communication and awareness of what's required. I look after and install numerous Xerte installations for organisations. I've also helped them install. I look after, for instance, the NIACE installation and the previous TechDis installations. But also lots of organisations have broken down that initial barrier and just communicated correctly that this is a free, open source, robust tool and isn't going to cost us anything. Will happily sit on an existing server. And if you look at the resources, there's guides to installation, webinars that I've done previously on behalf of TechDis on explaining all of that. And if all of that fails, there is external hosting that, again, myself and colleagues provide. So there is very quick access if you want it and you want to pursue that. What there isn't is a free online service that you can use like the Sandpit used to provide. And part of the reason for that is actually the pilots are done, that the evidence is out there, as you've seen from the wealth of resources that I've shared. So really it's a case of establishing that installation within your organisation and benefiting from all the sharing and collaboration and ability for everybody to use it that comes with that provision.
Brilliant, thanks Ron. Maria, I hope that answered your question there. If there are any other questions, we'll leave the webinar open for a couple of minutes if there are any other questions, but if not, once again, on behalf of Learning Futures, just like to thank Ron and thank everybody for attending, and hope that you found that useful.
And Emily, yes, there's inbuilt Moodle integration, so you can have Xerte installed on the same server as your Moodle, and when you log into Moodle, you're automatically logged into Xerte. So it works extremely well like that.
Okay, all of the chat, I think Emily and John are just exchanging some messages there about integrating with Moodle. That's great.
John, what do you mean? Is the resource for what? Yes, it's built into the Xerte download. There's a documentation folder and there's a document that I wrote about enabling authentication integration with Moodle. It's important to pick that out, that if you create a learning object in any Xerte installation, you can make it publicly available and embed it in any Moodle. The Moodle integration we're talking about here is the authentication integration, so that you have it set up somebody logs into Moodle, they follows the link to Xerte, and they're automatically authenticated to Xerte, and that's how you can make it available to all your staff and all your students incredibly easily. The other option is LDAP, or Active Directory, which some organisations obviously use.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, everybody. We're going to close the webinar meeting then. Please remember to use the Learning Futures site if you've got questions that you want to continue to ask, or as I say, if you have a go at the resources, have a look at the CPD activities, then please do share through a blog or useful resources. But other than that, thank you for attending today. We hope that you found it useful and that you attend one of the other CPD modules. So hope you have a great afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you soon.